The wind in Red Dust Gulch had a voice, a low moan that never quite died. It was the sound of 1,000 miles of empty, sun-scorched land complaining about its thirst. It funneled dust the color of old blood down the single street, scouring the raw lumber of the saloon and the false front of the mercantile. The year was 1887, and the town was less a settlement than a scar, carved into the hide of the high plains where Montana Territory bled into Wyoming. The railroad was coming. Its surveyor's stakes, stark as bone, marched across the sagebrush flats, promising a future that felt as distant and unforgiving as the hard blue sky. Inside the combined post office and telegraph station, Eliza Mayfield was deaf to the wind. She heard only the clean, sharp language of the brass key under her fingers. Click, clack, click, click. The rhythm was a comfort, a fence of logic she built around herself each day. It was a language without sentiment, a code of pure information that traveled 1,000 miles in a heartbeat, far faster than a person could run from a past they did not want to claim. Her hand moved with an economy of motion learned on a Missouri farm, where wasted effort meant a harder winter. Here, it meant clarity. A message from Cheyenne about freight manifests, the price of beef, the delayed arrival of a federal judge. Simple facts. She liked facts. They did not lie or change their minds or break your mother's heart. The heat pressed in through the single glass window, warping the view of the livery stable across the street. The Powder River, usually a respectable artery of brown water, had dwindled to a feeble pulse in a bed of cracked mud. Thirst was a constant presence in the gulch, a character in every conversation. It made tempers short and hope a fragile commodity. Eliza dipped her pen in the inkwell, logged the message, and leaned back, the wood of her chair creaking in protest. She was a woman of straight lines, from the severe part in her brown hair to the direct, assessing gaze of her gray eyes. She had come west to be the town's telegraph operator and to tutor the children of the few families stubborn enough to put down roots in this dust. In truth, she had come to disappear into a place so vast and new that the shadows of a failed farm and a splintered family could not reach her. At the edge of town, where the parched grass gave way to the river's gravelly banks, Chaska Redhawk watched his people's horses drink from the sluggish stream. He stood with the stillness of a man who was part of the landscape, his buckskin shirt the color of the dry earth, his dark hair held back by a simple leather band. Tucked into one of his long braids was the single, iridescent feather of a magpie, its black and white a stark reminder of a life lost. His older brother, Tasunke, had worn one just like it. Tasunke had died 2 summers ago, not in a battle of honor, but in a pointless skirmish with the hired guns of the railroad. Men who shot first and asked questions never. The man who gave the order was named Pike. Now Chaska was the one who watched over the last of their horses, the final remnants of their hunting grounds. He was not a chief, just a warrior young enough to still feel the fire of anger, but old enough to know that fire, untended, consumed everything. He carried the weight of his brother's memory and the heavier burden of his people's future. They came to the river because it was all that was left. The railroad survey lines had cut off their access to the deeper springs in the foothills, a slow strangulation that felt more final than any cavalry charge. The quiet of the afternoon was shattered by the crack of a rifle. It was not a hunter's shot. It was followed by another, then a volley. Panic erupted. Horses screamed and scattered. Chaska's hand went to the knife at his belt. He saw them then. A dozen riders cresting the low bluff overlooking the river. Railroad men. And at their head, a thick-bodied man with a dusty bowler hat and a face like a clenched fist. Jedediah Pike. They were firing into the air, but their intent was clear. It was a show of force, an act of intimidation. Then, one of the shots went low. A puff of dust kicked up scant inches from a little girl who had been filling a water skin. Her mother snatched her up with a terrified cry, the sound swallowed by the noise and confusion. It was not a raid. It was a provocation, a performance for an unseen audience. Pike's men spurred their horses down the bank. rounding up the few elders and children who hadn't fled, herding them like cattle. Chaska saw it all in a frozen, terrible clarity. This was how it began. An incident, manufactured and bloody, that would be telegraphed to the world as an uprising. It would be the excuse Pike needed to have the army clear the land for good, to make it safe for the Iron Horse. Tasunke's death had been a prelude. This was the main act. Rage, cold and pure, settled in his gut. But he knew rage was a luxury. He needed a lever, something to shift the balance of power, if only for an hour. His eye scanned the town, the cluster of buildings baking in the sun, the saloon, the marshal's office, the chapel, and the telegraph station, the place where lies could be turned into truth and sent across the world on a wire. Eliza heard the shouting before she heard the gunshots. She stood up, her hand resting on the telegraph key as if it were a talisman. Through the window, she saw the chaos at the river, the riders storming down the bank. Townsfolk were spilling out of the saloon, their faces a mixture of fear and a grim, predictable excitement. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the violent clash that would justify their own precarious hold on this land. The door to the post office flew open and a man strode in, bringing the scent of dust and wild sage with him. He was Lakota, tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to consume the small, cluttered room. His eyes, dark and intense, found hers instantly. They held no warmth, only a fierce, calculated purpose. In his braid, a black and white feather seemed to absorb the light. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence was a command. "You will stop," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she expected. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She stared at the knife sheathed at his hip, then back at his face. Her training, her entire nature, was to remain calm, to analyze, to find the logical path. She swallowed. "Stop what?" "The talking wire," he said, nodding toward the telegraph key. "No more words leave this place." Before she could process the demand, he was across the room, his hand closing over hers on the key. His touch was not brutal, but it was absolute. A current of a different kind shot up her arm. It was the feel of unshakable resolve. Her mind raced. This was no random act of violence. This was precise. "There are children down there," he said, his gaze fixed on hers. "Elders. Pike's men have them. He thinks he can make a story here today, a story of a savage attack." The pieces clicked into place in Eliza's mind. She had seen Pike and his crew. They swaggered through town with the arrogance of men who owned the future. She had never trusted their easy smiles or their promises of prosperity. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "A trade," he said simply. "My people for you." The air left her lungs. A hostage. The word was ugly. A violation. It was something that happened in dime novels, not to a telegraph operator from Missouri. But the look in his eyes told her this was no fiction. This was the grim arithmetic of survival. "They will not trade for me," she said, a tremor of fear finally breaking through her control. "I am nobody here." "You are the voice of this town," he replied, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second. "You are the one who tells the world what happens. Pike cannot afford for that voice to tell the wrong story. He will trade." He was right. She was not just a woman. She was a symbol. She was the telegraph, the nerve that connected this raw outpost to the spine of the nation. To control her was to control the narrative. Outside, the shouting intensified. She could hear Pike's booming voice and the weaker, placating tones of Marshal Whitcomb. The law in Red Dust Gulch was a tired old man with a tarnished star and a preference for peace at any price. The Lakota warrior, Chaska, pulled her away from the desk, positioning her near the door but shielded by his body. "Tell the marshal the terms," he instructed, his voice a low command in her ear. "The woman for the old ones and the children, they must be allowed to leave, unharmed. Then I will release her. Eliza took a breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and her own fear. She called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Marshal Whitcomb." The marshal appeared in the doorway, his face pale and sweating. Behind him, Pike sat on his horse, a smug, possessive look on his face. He had his incident. "Miss Mayfield, are you all right?" Whitcomb asked, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "He wants to trade," Eliza said, repeating the terms clearly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Let his people go, and he will let me go." Pike laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Now why would we do that? The savage has given us a gift, an attack on a federal office, an assault on a white woman. This is all the justification I need." Chaska's body went rigid beside her. Eliza could feel the anger radiating from him, a dangerous heat. He was a tightly coiled spring. She had to de-escalate this for her own sake. "Think, Mr. Pike," she called out, her mind seizing on the only leverage they had. "What story will I tell when this is over? What message will I send on this wire? The one about a brave railroad man saving a hostage, or the one about how your men fired on children and you refused a peaceful trade, letting a woman come to harm just to steal a piece of land?" The smug look on Pike's face faltered. He looked from her to the telegraph office, then back. The woman was smarter than he gave her credit for. She understood the power she held. The story was everything. He spat on the ground. "Let the old ones go," he barked at his men. "Keep the men." "The children, too." Chaska's voice was a low growl beside Eliza. Pike hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he gave a curt nod. The Lakota elders and children were pushed forward, and they began a slow, dignified retreat toward the hills, their faces impassive masks hiding a world of fear and fury. When they were gone, Chaska pulled Eliza out into the blinding sunlight. He moved quickly, efficiently, swinging up onto his pinto horse in a single motion and pulling her up to sit in front of him. The rough leather of his leggings pressed against her skirt, the heat of his body a solid wall at her back. It was a shocking, terrifying intimacy. The entire town was watching, their faces a gallery of silent judgment. "You gave your word," Eliza said, her voice tight. "My people are not yet safe," he answered, his arm a steel band around her waist. He urged the horse forward, not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating trot that spoke of urgency, not panic. They rode out of Red Dust Gulch as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. Eliza did not look back. She kept her spine straight, her hands clenched in her lap. She was a prisoner, an object in a transaction she did not control. But her mind was her own. She began to observe, to file away details, the way he sat the horse, the tension in his shoulders, the direction of the sun. She was a telegraph operator. She knew how to read the signals. She would find a way to negotiate, to survive, to restore the order that had been so violently broken. She believed she had the advantage of intellect, of civilization. Chaska guided the horse toward a formidable ridge of shattered rock that clawed at the sky, a landmark the locals called the Devil's Stare. He felt the woman's rigid posture, the fear she was trying so hard to master. He took no pleasure in it, but this was the only path he could see, the only move that did not end in a massacre. He had exposed Pike's hand and saved the children. Now he just had to get to the safety of the hidden valleys, where his people waited. He had the advantage of the land, of knowing every rock and ravine. He held the woman, and with her, he held the truth of what happened today. For now, that was enough. As they began the treacherous climb, the first long shadows of evening stretching behind them, each of them, the prisoner and the warrior, was certain they held the upper hand. The world on the other side of the Devil's Stare was a different kind of cruel. The plains here were not just dry. They were scorched, a landscape of silvery green sagebrush and the skeletal remains of last year's grasses. They rode for hours under a sun that was not a source of light, but a physical weight, pressing down, leaching the moisture from the air, from the ground, from their own bodies. Eliza's initial fear had settled into a dull, throbbing ache of exhaustion and uncertainty. She was no longer a telegraph operator or a teacher. She was cargo, held in place by the unyielding arm of a man whose name she now knew was Chaska, and whose silence was as vast and intimidating as the country they moved through. They followed no trail she could discern, winding through dry washes, the arroyos like deep cracks in the skin of the earth. The pinto horse moved with a sure-footed stamina that Eliza, a farmer's daughter, could not help but admire. It was a good animal, tough and intelligent. Late in the afternoon, while navigating a steep, shale-littered bank, the horse stumbled. It recovered quickly, but Chaska felt the change in its gait at once. He slid to the ground and ran a hand down the animal's right foreleg. The horse flinched. Eliza watched from the ground as he examined the leg. She saw the dark line of blood just above the hoof, a clean slice from a sharp piece of stone. Chaska's face was a grim mask. Out here, a lame horse was a death sentence. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt to wipe away the blood and dust, his movements economical and precise, but tinged with a frustration he could not entirely hide. Something in Eliza shifted. The horse was an innocent in this conflict, a creature of bone and muscle doing what was asked of it. Her fear, for a moment, was eclipsed by a lifetime of instinct. She took a step forward. "That needs to be cleaned properly," she said. Her voice was husky with thirst. Chaska did not look up. "I know what to do." "I am sure you do," she said, her tone unexpectedly firm. "But my father taught me that a stone cut on a horse is an invitation to poison in the blood. Dirt is the enemy. You need water to flush it, and something to draw out the inflammation." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would she offer help? What trick was this? But her face held no guile, only a frank and serious concern. She pointed a dusty finger at a low, grayish-leafed plant growing in a patch of stubborn soil nearby. "That's yarrow. If you crush the leaves into a paste, it will help stop the bleeding and keep the wound clean. It is better than a dry cloth." He stared at the plant, then back at her. This was not knowledge he expected from a woman who talked to a wire. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, while he held the horse steady. Eliza gathered a handful of the yarrow leaves. Using 2 flat stones, she pounded them into a rough, fragrant mash. She worked with a quiet competence. Her hands, though city-softened, remembering the rhythms of the farm. When she was done, she used Chaska's water skin, taking only a few precious drops to moisten the poultice. She approached the horse slowly, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur. The animal stood still as she gently, carefully, packed the green paste into the cut. Chaska watched her every move, his expression unreadable. He saw the way she handled the horse, with a respect that was both practical and gentle. When she finished, she looked up at him, her gray eyes direct. "It needs to be wrapped. Your strip of cloth will do. But it must be tight enough to hold the poultice. Not so tight it cuts the skin." Wordlessly, he handed her the strip of buckskin. She wrapped the leg with a practiced efficiency, tying a knot that was neat and secure. For a long moment, they stood in silence beside the injured animal, the vast, empty land stretching out around them. He had taken her captive, but in that small act of healing, she had claimed a piece of ground between them, a space defined not by force, but by shared, useful knowledge. A fragile bridge of respect had been built, stone by stone, in the middle of a burnt and broken plain. They traveled more slowly after that, Chaska walking to spare the horse, as twilight bled across the sky, turning the dust in the air to a haze of lavender and rose. The landscape began to change. The plains gave way to rolling foothills, and the air grew cooler. The silence between them remained, but its quality had changed. It was less a wall and more a shared space, filled with the sound of his footsteps, the soft tread of the horse, and the rising chirp of crickets. That night, They made a cold camp in the shelter of a rock outcropping. He gave her a piece of dried meat and a sip of water. He did not tie her hands. He did not need to. The wilderness was a more effective cage than any rope. The cold was a sharp, physical presence, sinking into her bones. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the vast, lonely quiet. A quiet so profound it felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The next day, the sky took on a strange, yellow cast. The air grew heavy and still. Chaska stopped, scanning the horizon. His body taut. "A storm is coming," he said. The first unsolicited words he had spoken to her in a day. Dust. He led them to a shallow cave carved into the side of a bluff by centuries of wind and water. They had barely taken shelter when the world outside disappeared. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a deafening roar. Then the dust hit, a solid wall of reddish-brown dirt that blotted out the sun and scoured the rock. Eliza pressed herself into the back of the cave. A corner of her skirt pulled over her nose and mouth. She wanted to speak, to fill the terrifying, roaring void with a human sound, but the grit was already coating her tongue. Chaska sat near the entrance, a silent sentinel, seemingly untroubled by the elemental fury. He caught her eye and made a simple gesture, tapping his chest and then breathing out slowly. He was telling her to control her breathing, to conserve her energy. She obeyed, forcing herself into a slow, rhythmic calm. In the suffocating darkness of the cave, with the world being unmade outside, she learned a new rule: there were forces against which speaking was useless, against which the only sane response was a disciplined silence. When the storm finally passed hours later, it left behind a world remade, coated in a fresh layer of fine red powder. The air was clean and cool. As they emerged, Chaska pointed to the bruised-looking clouds retreating on the eastern horizon. "Those clouds," he said, his voice raspy with dust. "They carry the storm away, but the ones that will follow, the small, puffy ones that look like bison calves in spring, they will bring rain. You can read the sky if you know its language." It was a lesson, offered freely. Another stone laid on the bridge between them. Late that afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Eliza gasped. Below them lay a hidden valley, a slash of impossible green tucked into the brown and ochre hills. A stream, clear and bright, snaked through a meadow dotted with cottonwood trees. Smoke curled lazily from the tops of several hide lodges nestled near the stream. It was the Lakota camp. As they descended into the valley, people emerged from the lodges. Their faces were wary, their eyes holding a deep suspicion as they looked at her. She was the outsider, the enemy. Chaska spoke to them in his own language, his tone low and urgent. The story of the confrontation in Red Dust Gulch passed through the small crowd, and the looks they gave her softened, not with friendship, but with a shared understanding of the threat they all faced. An older woman stepped forward. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her white hair neatly parted in 2 long braids. She moved with an unhurried grace, and her eyes, when they met Eliza's, were as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. This was Mabel Two Moons. "So," Mabel said, her English surprisingly clear, "you are the one who speaks through the singing wire." She circled Eliza slowly, taking in her dusty, trail-worn appearance. "Chaska has brought us a bird with a clipped wing. She can sing the truth, but her cage is far away." Mabel looked at Chaska, then back to Eliza. "You will not be tied here," she said, her voice carrying an authority that no one would question. "A rope is an insult to the spirit, but you are not free to leave. This valley is our last sanctuary. We cannot risk Pike knowing of its existence. You are our guest and our prisoner until this trouble is settled." Later, as Eliza sat by a small fire, soaking the ache from her feet in a basin of warm water Mabel had provided, the old woman sat down beside her. She handed Eliza a bowl of savory stew. "Pike is a man who sets his own house on fire so he can claim the insurance," Mabel said, echoing the sentiment Eliza had felt herself. This attack was no surprise. He has been trying to drive us from this land for 2 seasons. Not for the railroad, for the water. Eliza looked up, confused. The water. The stream in this valley is fed by a sacred spring in the high hills, Mabel explained, her voice dropping. It is the lifeblood of this land. We have used it for generations. 2 months ago, Pike's railroad crews dug a deep canal. They claimed it was for drainage, but they were clever. The canal cut deep into the earth and stole the heart of the spring, diverting most of the water flow miles to the south, toward land Pike has claimed for himself. That is why the Powder River is dying. That is why our people are thirsty. He is trying to choke us out, so he can take the land and its water for nothing. The truth of it settled on Eliza with a cold weight. This was not about prejudice or expansion. It was about greed, simple and brutal. Chaska's desperate act in the telegraph office was not an attack. It was the last move of a man trying to checkmate a king who owned the entire board. Her fear was slowly being replaced by something else, a slow-burning indignation. The night was cold again, but now there was the warmth of the fire and the low murmur of voices from other lodges. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. From somewhere in the darkness, the steady, rhythmic beat of a distant drum began, a sound so deep it felt less heard than felt, like the thrumming of a great heart deep within the earth. Eliza sat wrapped in a thick bison robe, the alien sound of the drum a strange comfort. She shivered, as much from emotion as from the cold. Chaska walked over and stood before the fire, his face half in shadow. He watched her for a moment, then reached into a small pouch at his belt and held something out to her. It was a stone, a stream-tumbled pebble, dark and perfectly smooth. He placed it in her open palm. It was cool at first, then quickly absorbed the warmth of her skin. It felt solid, real, an anchor in this sea of strangeness. "To keep your hands from shaking," he said, his voice a low rumble. She closed her fingers around the stone, its smoothness a small comfort. She looked at his face, silhouetted against the flames. The firelight carved deep lines of worry and anger around his eyes and mouth. He seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. "Do you always scowl like that?" The question was out before she could stop it, a small, reckless spark of her old self. He turned his head, and his dark eyes met hers across the flickering light. For the first time, she saw something beyond the warrior's discipline, a deep well of weariness and sorrow. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "I'm saving my smiles," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel. "For when there's water, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and gray. In the hour before dawn." Chaska stopped the horse on a low ridge overlooking the sleeping form of Red Dust Gulch. The town was a collection of dark, geometric shapes huddled against the vast emptiness of the plains. He slid from the pinto's back and then reached up to help Eliza down. Her muscles screamed in protest. Every part of her ached from the long days in the saddle. They stood on the crest of the hill, the cool morning air a relief after the oppressive heat of the day before. The silence was broken only by the soft snort of the horse and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Chaska turned to her, his face unreadable in the dim light. The magpie feather in his braid was a slash of black and white against the grayness. "From here, you can walk," he said. His voice was low, without inflection. "No one will see you return." Eliza hugged the thick bison robe around her shoulders. The smooth stone he had given her a solid weight in her pocket. She had expected a final demand, a threat, a condition for her release. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting. "What now?" she asked, her own voice a stranger's whisper. "Now, you make a choice," he said, his gaze fixed on the town below. "You go to the marshal. You tell him your story. Which one you tell is up to you." The simplicity of it stunned her. He was giving her the power, the story of a savage warrior who had taken a woman by force, or the story of a man trying to stop a thief from stealing the last thing his people had left. He had shown her the diverted stream, The dying land. He had shown her the quiet dignity of his people in the hidden valley. He had trusted her with the truth. Now he was trusting her with his life. "Pike will have men hunting you," she said, the words a stark fact in the cold air. "They are always hunting us," he replied. A deep weariness in his tone. He turned his eyes to meet hers. They were not the hard, angry eyes of the man who had burst into her office. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much loss. "The talking wire is your weapon. Eliza Mayfield, I took it from you. Now I am giving it back. Use it for the truth, whatever you decide that is." He swung himself onto his horse, the movement as fluid and natural as a hawk taking flight. He did not look back. He simply melted into the deepening shadows of the foothills, leaving Eliza alone on the ridge with the weight of his choice, and now her own, settling upon her. She waited until the sun's first rays touched the horizon. Then she straightened her shoulders, smoothed her dusty skirt, and began the long walk back into town. Red Dust Gulch was just beginning to stir. Smoke curled from the chimney of the blacksmith's shop, and the smell of coffee drifted from the saloon. But the normal morning quiet was gone. As Eliza walked down the main street, it was as if she had become a ghost. Doors closed softly as she approached. Faces appeared in windows, only to vanish when she looked their way. The few men out on the boardwalk stopped their conversations, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and a dark, prurient curiosity. The whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. She did not have to hear the exact words to know their meaning. A woman taken. 2 nights in the wilderness. The things that must have happened. The stain they imagined was on her was more visible to them than the dust and grime that covered her dress. Her reputation, the only currency a woman alone possessed, was being spent with every step she took. She ignored the stairs, her gaze fixed on the sign for Parker's boarding house. Nell Parker was a widow in her 50s, a woman with a spine of iron and a face that had seen everything the West could throw at a person and had refused to flinch. She was standing on the porch, a broom in her hand, her expression one of grim disapproval directed not at Eliza, but at the town. "Get inside, child," Nell said, her voice a low command. She held the door open, her body a shield against the prying eyes of the street. They're circling like buzzards over a sick cow. Inside, the boarding house smelled of baking bread and lemon oil. It was an oasis of order and decency. Nell bolted the door and led Eliza into the kitchen. She pushed her gently into a chair, then ladled hot water from the stove into a basin. "Wash yourself," she said, her tone softening. "There is stew on the stove and a clean bed waiting upstairs. The whispering will stop when they find something new to chew on." Eliza's control finally crumbled. A single hot tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "They think—" "I know what they think," Nell interrupted, her voice sharp but not unkind. "They are small people with small lives. They fill the empty spaces with filth. Did he harm you?" Eliza looked up, meeting the older woman's clear, steady gaze. "No, he was honorable." Nell nodded, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. "I thought as much. I've seen that one. Chaska. He does not have the look of a brute. Now, eat. You cannot fight a war on an empty stomach." After she had eaten, after the warmth of the food had begun to chase the chill from her bones, Eliza knew what she had to do. She left the sanctuary of the boarding house and walked to the marshal's office. Marshal Whitcomb was a man who looked perpetually defeated by his own uniform. It hung on his stooped shoulders, the silver star on his chest tarnished and dull. He was sitting behind his desk, shuffling papers with a singular lack of purpose. Jedediah Pike was there, his bulk filling the small office, a thick cigar clamped in his teeth. He smiled when Eliza walked in, a predator's smile. "Well, well," Pike boomed, his voice oozing a false sympathy. "Look what the cat dragged in. We were just organizing a posse to come rescue you, little lady. Good thing you saved us the trouble." I came to make a statement. Marshal, Eliza said, ignoring Pike and addressing the lawman directly. Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting from Eliza to Pike. Of course, Miss Mayfield. We are all very relieved to see you are safe. I am here to report a crime, Eliza continued, her voice clear and steady. Jedediah Pike and his men are attempting to steal water and land from the Lakota people who live near this town. The air in the office went still. Pike's smile vanished. Whitcomb's face went pale. Now, hold on. Miss Mayfield, the marshal stammered. Those are serious accusations. You have been through a terrible ordeal. Perhaps your mind is confused. My mind is perfectly clear, Eliza stated. Mr. Pike's men fired on unarmed people, including children. He is diverting the water from their springs to his own land claims. I have seen it with my own eyes. Pike took a step forward, his face mottled with rage. This is nonsense. The woman has been with a savage for 2 days. Her mind has been twisted. She is spouting his lies. He turned to Whitcomb, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Marshal, are you going to listen to this traitorous talk, or are you going to arrest the man who abducted her? Whitcomb looked at Eliza, his expression pleading. He was a weak man, caught between a powerful bully and a woman with an inconvenient truth. He chose the path of least resistance. Miss Mayfield, without proof. This is just your word against Mr. Pike's. I must have evidence. Then do your job and find it. Eliza's voice cracked with frustration. My job, Whitcomb said, his voice barely a whisper, is to keep the peace. Eliza knew then that there was no justice to be found in this office. The law had been bought and paid for. She turned and walked out, the sound of Pike's triumphant laughter following her. Dejected, she walked back toward the telegraph station, the weight of her failure heavy on her shoulders. As she passed the small mercantile run by Li Wei, the quiet, meticulous Chinese man who supplied the town with everything from canned peaches to blasting powder, a commotion occurred. A crate of tinned goods slipped from Li Wei's grasp, spilling cans across the boardwalk at her feet. My apologies, Miss Mayfield, he said, bowing his head as he scrambled to gather the tins. Very clumsy. As he knelt, he pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand, his movement so swift and subtle she barely felt it. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent exchange of understanding. He was an outsider, too. He knew what it was like to be unheard. She did not look at the paper until she was safely inside the telegraph office. The door locked behind her. It was an invoice, a copy of a bill of sale made out to the Territorial Railroad Company and signed by Pike himself. The items listed were damming 500 feet of lumber for sluice construction, 50 shovels, and 12 cases of blasting powder. It was dated 2 months ago. It was the proof the marshal had demanded, proof that Pike had lied, that he had built the canal to steal the water. She sat at her desk, the invoice in one hand, the smooth stone from Chaska in the other. Her office, once a place of quiet routine, now felt like the center of a battlefield. The brass key of the telegraph sat before her, gleaming in the afternoon light. It was her weapon. Chaska had been right. Her fingers found their familiar place on the key. She did not send a message about her abduction. She did not send a message about Chaska Redhawk. Instead, she composed a careful, official-sounding query addressed to the Union Pacific Land Grant Office in Cheyenne. She requested confirmation of Appropriation Order number 734, the order Pike had posted on the marshal's door, the one that supposedly gave him legal authority over the lands bordering the Powder River. She cited the survey markers and the official seal number. It was a long shot, a piece of due diligence. She sent the message and waited. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The sounds of the town filtered in, muted and distant. She was in a world of her own, a world of wire and electricity and the hope of a single, clarifying fact. Just as the sun began to dip below the rooftops, the telegraph began to chatter. Her hands flew to the key, her mind translating the frantic clicks and clacks into words. The message was short and it made her blood run cold. No such order. 734 exists. Stop. Seal number cited is forgery. Stop. That seal retired from service last year. Stop. Upper agent en route to investigate. Stop. A forgery, the entire foundation of Pike's power, his legal authority, was a lie. He was not just a bully and a thief, he was a fraud. A knock on the door startled her. She quickly hid the telegram and the invoice in a ledger book. She opened the door a crack. A man she had never seen before stood on the boardwalk. He was lean and wiry, dressed in the practical buckskins of a scout. But his face was not that of an American frontiersman. He had the dark eyes and sharp features of a French Canadian. He held his hat in his hands, his expression a mixture of politeness and a deep, unsettling sadness. "Pardon, mademoiselle," he said, his English accented. "My name is Etienne Lequier. I am a guide, under contract to Mr. Pike. He wishes for me to send a message for him." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked into his eyes and saw a troubled conscience. This man knew. He knew what Pike was doing, and it was eating him alive. "The office is closed for the day," she said, her voice colder than she intended. His gaze flickered past her to the telegraph key, then back to her face. There was a moment of silent appraisal, a weighing of her character. "Of course," he said softly. "My apologies for the intrusion." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more. "The land, she is a hard mistress. She makes good men do difficult things." He turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped. Eliza watched him go, a new and dangerous player in a game whose rules were changing with every hour. She closed and locked the door, her back pressed against the wood. She had the invoice. She had the telegram. She had the truth. Chaska had left the choice to her, and she had made it. She was no longer a victim, no longer a pawn. She was the woman who spoke through the singing wire, and she was about to make it sing a song of justice that Jedediah Pike would never forget. Getting a message to Chaska was a dangerous and delicate operation. Red Dust Gulch had become a town of watching eyes and listening ears. Eliza could not simply ride out. Pike's men were a constant, swaggering presence, and the townspeople's suspicion clung to her like the fine red dust. She needed an ally, someone who moved through the town's hidden currents, unnoticed. The choice was clear. That evening, she went to Lee Way's mercantile to purchase a small sack of flour she did not need. The store was empty. As Lee Way weighed the flour, his movements precise and economical, Eliza spoke in a low voice, her back to the door. "I need to get a message to the hills, to the man who brought me back." Lee Way did not look up from his scales. He added a pinch more flour, his face an impassive mask. "The wind carries many messages. Most are lost." "This one cannot be," Eliza insisted softly. "It is a matter of life. Yours, too, perhaps. Pike will not stop with them." He finished tying the sack with a neat knot and slid it across the counter. Underneath it was a small, ink-stained brush and a scrap of wrapping paper. "The wind is strongest at dawn," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It blows toward the rising sun." He then spoke in a louder, more formal tone. 20 cents. Miss Mayfield, thank you for your custom." She understood. She left the coin on the counter and returned to the quiet of her office. By the light of a single lamp, she wrote the message. There were no names, no details of the evidence she had found. It was a simple request, a set of coordinates in the language of the land. Granite Pass, 2 sunrises from now, at noon. Come alone. She wrapped the note around a small stone and, just before dawn, left it on the rear step of the mercantile, where the easterly wind would not disturb it. She had to trust that Lee Way knew the secret paths, the quiet messengers who could carry her words into the wilderness. 2 days later, Eliza rode out of town. She did not sneak. She rode a rented mare from the livery, a basket with a loaf of bread and a book strapped to the saddle. She told a curious Nell Parker that she was going to sketch the rock formations near the old granite quarry. a harmless, spinsterly pursuit that no one would question. But as she cleared the last of the town's dusty outskirts, her posture straightened, and her hand went to the inside pocket of her jacket where the folded invoice and the carefully transcribed telegram rested against her heart. The ride to Granite Pass was a long, arduous climb. The sky, which had been a brilliant, unforgiving blue that morning, was turning sullen. A heavy, bruised-looking bank of clouds was building in the west, and the air grew thick and still with a palpable tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. By the time she reached the pass, a high, wind-swept saddle of shattered gray rock, the sun was a pale wafer behind a veil of thickening cloud. The wind had picked up, and it had a cold, sharp edge to it. She dismounted in a small grove of stunted, wind-twisted pines and waited. The silence was immense, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the rocks. She felt small and terribly exposed. This could be a trap. Chaska might not have even received the message. Pike's men could be waiting behind any one of the towering granite tors. He appeared so silently she did not see him until he was 20 feet away, standing beside a rock outcropping, his pinto horse blending into the shadows. He had not made a sound. One moment he was not there, and the next he was. He watched her for a long moment, his face grim, his eyes searching hers for any sign of betrayal. "You came alone," he said. It was not a question. "So did you," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no noise on the rocky ground. "This is a foolish risk. For both of us." "The truth is a greater risk," she said. She reached into her pocket and held out the papers. "This is the proof. A bill for the canal Pike built to steal your water. And this," she paused, the weight of the words still shocking to her. "This is the message I received from the railroad office in Cheyenne. The land order Pike is using is a forgery. The seal is fake. He has no legal right to any of it." Chaska took the papers, his eyes scanning the words. A muscle tightened in his jaw. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and at that moment, the first fat, cold drop of rain struck her cheek. Then another. The sky, which had been threatening for hours, finally broke. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the pass, and the rain began to fall in earnest. A cold, driving sheet that turned the gray granite black and instantly soaked through her jacket. Lightning spider-webbed across the dark clouds, followed by a much louder clap of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. "We must find shelter," Chaska shouted over the rising roar of the storm. He grabbed the reins of her horse and led her toward a dark cleft in the rock face she had not noticed before. Behind a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper, there was a low opening. It was the entrance to an abandoned miner's shack, a crude hovel built of stacked, flat stones, more a cave than a cabin. He pushed her gently inside, then followed, pulling the horses into the small overhang just outside the entrance. The inside of the shack was dark and smelled of damp earth, cold stone, and the ghosts of long-dead fires. It was barely large enough for two people to stand. The storm raged outside, a symphony of roaring wind and drumming rain. Another brilliant flash of lightning lit the interior of the small shelter for a split second, illuminating Chaska's face. She saw the fierce, triumphant gleam in his eyes as he looked down at the papers in his hand, and in that instant, she knew she had made the right choice. The temperature plummeted. The cold, damp air of the shack seeped into her bones, and she began to shiver, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Chaska noticed at once he unstrapped the bison robe from his own saddle, the same one he had given her in the Lakota camp, and draped it around her shoulders. The familiar weight and scent of it were a strange comfort. They stood in the cramped darkness, the storm a violent wall between them and the world. The only sounds were the thunder and the ragged rhythm of her own breathing. She hugged the thick robe tighter around her, the shaking beginning to subside. "The first day," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the noise of the rain, "I was your prisoner." Chaska turned his head to look at her. The darkness hid his expression, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He was silent for a long time. The only sound, the drumming of the rain on the stone roof. "I thought so," he said at last, his voice a low, rough murmur that was barely audible. Another flash of lightning bleached the world white, and in that stark, fleeting light, she saw his face, the hard lines softened by an emotion she could not name. He looked directly at her, his eyes holding hers. "But now I know." He took a slow breath. The virgin was his prisoner. The Lakota warrior soon found he was the one captured for life. The words hung in the cold, damp air between them, more profound and binding than any vow spoken in a church. They were the plain, unvarnished truth of what had happened to them. He had taken her to gain leverage, and in the process, had lost his own freedom, her courage, her sense of justice, her quiet resilience. They had captured him more surely than any rope or cage. Her shivering had stopped. A different kind of tremor started deep inside her. He reached out, not to touch her face or her body, but to gently take her hand. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they wrapped around her cold ones, a simple, solid connection in the heart of the storm. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound recognition, an acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond that had been forged between them in fire and dust and fear. They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand, sharing the warmth of the bison robe as the thunder rolled through the mountains. There was no need for more words. A promise had been made, an alliance sealed not with ink and paper, but with a shared glance in a lightning flash. "We will take this to the district court in Cheyenne," Eliza said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won resolve. "We will expose him." "He will not let us get that far," Chaska answered, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Pike does not follow the white man's law. He only follows the law of the gun. This will have to end here, in these hills." As they spoke, a figure stood in the driving rain at the edge of the juniper grove. Just beyond the entrance to the shack, Etienne Lequier watched the two horses huddled under the overhang, their heads drooping in the downpour. He was soaked to the skin, the water running in rivulets from the brim of his hat. He had followed Eliza from town, his conscience a heavier burden than the storm. He saw the faint, flickering light from within the stone shelter, heard the low murmur of their voices, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. He saw them not as captor and captive, but as two people standing together against the storm. His face was a mask of conflict, his loyalty torn between the man who paid his wages and the silent, damning truth he saw taking shelter in the heart of the mountain. He stood motionless in the deluge, a silent witness, his choice yet to be made. The back room of Lee Wei's mercantile smelled of dried ginger, tea leaves, and a faint, metallic tang of gunpowder. It was a small, windowless space, lit by a single lantern that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Here, the plan was born, pieced together from whispers and desperate courage. There were 4 of them, an alliance as unlikely as a river flowing uphill. Chaska stood by the wall, a silent, brooding presence. He had explained Pike's movements, the way he used a private, administrative car attached to the evening freight train as a mobile office, a rolling seat of his corrupt power. Eliza was at the small table, a map of the rail line sketched on a piece of butcher paper, her finger tracing the route. The forged documents and the invoice were evidence, but Pike was a man who lived in a fortress of paper. To defeat him, they needed his entire arsenal, the official land ledgers, the signed letters of authorization, the very books that gave his crimes the veneer of legality. Lee Wei, quiet and observant, pointed to a spot on the map, the trestle bridge over Coyote Creek. He said, "The train slows there. The grade is steep. It is the only place." The 4th member of their conspiracy was Tomas, a young vaquero whose family had run cattle in these hills for 2 generations before Pike's Canal had turned their best grazing land to a dust bowl. He was wiry and quick, with a face full of easy humor that did not quite hide the hard glint in his eyes. He had a personal score to settle with Pike, and a loyalty to the land that ran deeper than any law written on paper. "Slowing down is one thing," Tomas said, leaning over the map. "Climbing onto it while it moves is another. The guards on that car are paid to be bored, but they are not paid to be blind." "They will not be looking down," Chaska stated, his voice a low rumble. "They will be looking out. We come from below, from the side the bridge hides." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. They would ride alongside the train as it crossed the wooden trestle, using the noise and the structure of the bridge itself as cover. Chaska and Tomas, the most skilled riders, would get aboard first, securing the car. Li Wei had provided the tool's grappling hooks with ropes wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, and a heavy pry bar to force the car's door. Eliza's role was the most dangerous and the most crucial. "The administrative car is always the last one," she said, her voice calm and measured, betraying none of the fear coiling in her stomach. "The ledgers are kept in a locked safe at the front of the car. The guards will be at the rear door. You will be busy there. I will go in through the roof." Thomas stared at her. "Señorita Mayfield," he said slowly, "with all respect, have you ever been on the roof of a moving train before?" "I have never robbed one." "Either." "Thomas," she countered, a wry smile touching her lips. "It seems a poor time to be overly concerned with prior experience." She had stepped across a line. The woman who had arrived in Red Dust Gulch seeking quiet refuge was gone. In her place was someone she was only just beginning to recognize, a woman willing to commit a felony in the name of a justice the law refused to provide. It was a terrifying transformation, and a liberating one. The night of the crossing was moonless, the sky a vast spill of cold. Indifferent stars. They waited in a thicket of cottonwoods near the approach to the trestle bridge, the air humming with the sound of a million crickets. The horses were restless, sensing the tension in their riders. Eliza's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a counterpoint to the steady, distant rumble that was growing louder every second. Then it was there, the train, a monstrous black serpent with a single, glaring eye, breathing smoke and fire into the night. It hit the start of the bridge with a deafening clatter and groan, the old wood complaining under the immense weight. The engine labored up the incline, its rhythmic chuffing slowing, just as Li Wei had predicted. Now Chaska's voice cut through the noise. They spurred their horses, bursting from the cover of the trees and galloping onto the narrow service path that ran alongside the tracks. The ground shook. The wind from the passing train was a physical blow, tearing at their clothes and threatening to unseat them. Eliza clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her world reduced to the thundering chaos beside her and the dark, swaying shape of the final car. Chaska was a blur of motion, riding with a preternatural grace. He stood in his stirrups, swung his grappling hook, and with a fluid leap, was gone, swallowed by the darkness beneath the carriage. Thomas was right behind him. Eliza watched, her breath held tight in her chest, until she saw a dark shape emerge on the far side of the car and begin to climb. It was her turn. Thomas had looped the rope of a second hook over her saddle horn. She rode as close as she dared, the massive iron wheels of the train screaming on the rails a few feet from her leg. She threw the hook with all her strength. It caught. The rope went taut, nearly pulling her from the saddle. She kicked her feet free of the stirrups and swung out into the terrifying void, her boots scraping against the rough wood of the car. She hung there for a heartbeat, suspended over the dizzying drop to the creek bed below, before finding a foothold on a support beam. She began to climb, her fingers raw, her muscles straining. The wind was a solid wall, trying to peel her from the side of the train. Soot and cinders rained down from the engine smokestack, stinging her eyes. She reached the top of the car and scrambled onto the roof, lying flat on the rough, swaying surface as the train rattled across the bridge. Tomas's head appeared over the edge of the roof. He had made his way up from the other side, He grinned at her, his teeth a flash of white in the darkness. "Do you have any idea how old this bridge is?" he yelled over the roar of the train and the wind. Eliza pressed her cheek against the gritty roof, the vibration of the train running through her entire body. She had never felt so alive, or so close to death. "I do," she shouted back, a wild, reckless laugh bubbling up in her throat. "And I also know how to spell dismantle, if it breaks." At the rear of the car, Chaska and Li Wei were at work on the door. 2 guards, startled by the noise, appeared, but they were no match for Chaska's swift, brutal efficiency. He used his fists and the heavy pry bar, not his knife. These were hired men, not soldiers in a war. He disabled them quickly, leaving them bound and gagged with their own bandanas. Eliza crawled the length of the roof and dropped through a ventilation hatch that Li Wei had told her would be unsecured. She landed softly inside the car, which was surprisingly opulent, with plush velvet seats and polished mahogany walls. At the far end was a heavy iron safe. As Chaska and the others entered through the rear door, she was already examining it. It was a new model, with a combination lock. "There is no time to break it," Chaska said, his eyes scanning the car for any other threat. "We do not have to," Eliza said. She ran her hand along the top of the mahogany desk beside the safe. Taped to the underside, just out of sight, was a slip of paper. Pike was an arrogant man. Arrogant men were often lazy. She had gambled on the simple, foolish belief that he would not bother to memorize the combination. The numbers worked. The heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, survey maps, and 2 thick, leather-bound ledgers stamped with the official seal of the Territorial Land Office. They had found it, the heart of Pike's entire fraudulent enterprise. They gathered the books and the most important-looking files, stuffing them into a canvas sack. As they turned to leave, the forward door of the car slid open. A man stood silhouetted against the light from the next car. It was Etienne Lecuyer. His face was pale, and he held a pistol in his hand, but his arm was shaking. "You cannot," Etienne said, his voice a choked whisper. "He will destroy everything." Chaska pushed Eliza behind him, stepping forward to face the scout. "Get out of the way, Etienne!" "I cannot," the man repeated, his eyes filled with a terrible anguish. "He has my sister, a false charge, a jail in Cheyenne. He will see her hang if I fail him." The train swayed, and for a moment, the 2 men just stood there, caught in a tableau of impossible choices. Chaska looked at the desperation in Etienne's face, a mirror of the desperation he had felt himself. "3 winters ago," Chaska said, his voice low and hard, "in the Wolf Mountains, a blizzard. My hunting party was lost. You found us. You shared your fire, your food. You led us home." Etienne's pistol wavered. "A debt." "A debt," Chaska confirmed. He took a step to the side, leaving the path to the rear door clear. "Go! Your debt is paid. This does not make us even. It only means I will not kill you tonight." Etienne stared, his face a mask of disbelief and shame. He lowered the pistol, gave a single, jerky nod, and then vanished back into the forward car. They did not wait. They scrambled out of the car and leaped from the moving train, landing hard in the sagebrush and gravel as the last car cleared the trestle bridge. One of the horses, spooked by their sudden appearance, shied and scraped its flank against a sharp rock. A single drop of its blood, dark in the starlight, fell onto the cover of the topmost ledger, smearing across the embossed red wax of the official seal. The price of truth, paid in blood and risk. The next morning, Red Dust Gulch awoke to a new kind of fury. Jedediah Pike, his face the color of a thundercloud, stormed into the marshal's office. He was not a man who had been robbed. He was a king whose castle had been breached. He dictated a new proclamation, his voice booming through the town. This was not a simple theft. This was an act of sedition, an armed insurrection led by the renegade Chaska Redhawk. He was a threat to the peace, a danger to the very progress of the railroad. By noon, a new notice was nailed to the post outside the marshal's office, right over the forged land order. It was a wanted poster. It offered a $500 reward, a fortune in this dry and hungry land, for Chaska, dead or alive. The invisible war of paper and lies had just become a war of bullets and blood, with the reward for Chaska's capture echoing in every dusty corner of the territory. The main roads had become rivers of poison. To move south toward Cheyenne in the hope of a federal court was to invite a confrontation they could not win. Their only choice was to take to the high country, the rugged spine of the mountains that Pike's men, for all their bluster, did not know and feared. Mabel Two Moons, who had appeared on the edge of their camp the night after the train robbery as if summoned by the land itself, now led them. She knew the secret ways, the game trails and hidden passes that were not on any map. They traveled for days, climbing higher into a world of sharp granite peaks and deep, silent forests of pine and aspen. The early autumn air was crisp and clean, and the aspen groves were a breathtaking blaze of gold against the hard blue sky. For a few brief days, a fragile peace settled over their small, fugitive band. They were a family of circumstance, bound by a shared enemy and the heavy weight of the stolen ledgers that Li Wei and Tomas now guarded. But the mountains were fickle. The change came without warning. One afternoon, the brilliant blue sky began to fade, replaced by a strange, bruised-looking gray that seemed to absorb the light. The wind, which had been a playful whisper through the pines, developed a sharp, razor's edge. It carried a scent Eliza had never smelled before. The clean, sterile scent of ice. "Snow," Mabel said, her voice quiet but heavy with certainty. She scanned the horizon, her wrinkled face a mask of concern. "The sky is wrong. A storm comes. A hungry one." They were in a high, exposed alpine meadow when the first flakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a winter postcard. They were small and hard, like pellets of sand, driven by a wind that was rising to a keening howl. Within an hour, the world had disappeared. The golden aspens, the dark pines, the distant peaks, all were erased, swallowed by a churning, blinding wall of white. Mabel led them onward, her sense of direction seemingly independent of sight. She guided them down into a shallow, protected valley, a long, mournful hollow sheltered from the worst of the wind by a high granite ridge. The ground here was littered with the ghostly, white shapes of old bones, hundreds of them, the skeletal remains of a herd of cattle that had been caught in some long-ago blizzard and had perished. They had stumbled into a boneyard, a place the old ones called the Valley of White Bones. The grim setting was a stark reminder of their own mortality. The cold was a living thing, a predator that sank its teeth into them, seeking the warmth of their life. Eliza's mare, her city-bred mount, began to falter, its breath coming in ragged, steaming plumes. Eliza herself was shaking so hard she could barely hold the reins, the wet cold seeping through her coat and dress, chilling her to the marrow. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat. Mabel found them shelter under a broad rock ledge, a shallow cave that offered some protection from the driving snow. But they needed fire. Everything was coated in a layer of wet, heavy snow. Thomas and Li Wei searched for wood, their faces grim, but returned with only a few frozen, sodden branches. Hope began to dwindle. Mabel, however, was undeterred. She walked to the base of an ancient, gnarled pine that grew near the rock face, on the leeward side of the trunk, protected from the storm. A thick carpet of grayish-green moss grew on the bark. She began to carefully peel it away in long strips. "The land always provides," she said, her voice calm amidst the howl of the wind. "If you know where to look." She found a patch of dry punkwood deep in a hollow of the tree, and, using a flint and steel, she coaxed a tiny, precious spark to life, sheltering it with her own body. She fed it the dried moss until a small, Steady flame flickered, then grew. The fire was a miracle. It was life. They huddled around its small circle of warmth, their faces illuminated by the dancing light, their backs to the cold, devouring darkness. But Eliza could not stop shaking. The cold was inside her now, a deep, internal tremor that had more to do with fear than temperature. She felt the vast, crushing power of the storm, the indifference of the wilderness, the fragility of her own existence. Mabel sat beside her and took her cold hands. "You are fighting the storm," the old woman said, her voice a low, soothing hum. "You cannot win that fight. You will only tire yourself and grow colder." She placed Eliza's hand on her own chest. "Let your breath be a small fire inside you. Breathe in, slow and deep. Hold the warmth, breathe out, and let the fear go with it. Do not fight the cold. Accept it, and keep your own small fire burning." Eliza followed the instruction, her frantic, shallow gasps slowly giving way to a deep, controlled rhythm. She breathed in the scent of wood smoke and wet pine, held it, and then breathed out the panic, watching her breath plume white in the freezing air. The shaking subsided. A small kernel of calm settled in her chest. She was still cold, still afraid, but she was no longer drowning in it. The wind was a constant, violent roar. A dead branch, high up in the ancient pine, groaned under the weight of the snow and the relentless assault of the wind. Chaska, who had been securing the horses in the deeper part of the cave, saw the danger a split second before anyone else. He saw the massive limb begin to crack, to tear away from the trunk. Eliza was standing near the fire, her back to the tree. She heard the sharp, explosive crack of the wood, but had no time to react. Chaska moved with the explosive speed of a striking snake. He did not shout a warning. He simply launched himself at her, his body a solid wall that slammed into her, sending them both tumbling into a snowdrift away from the fire. A fraction of a second later, the branch, as thick as a man's body, crashed down precisely where she'd been standing, shattering on the frozen ground with a sound like a gunshot. Splinters of wood hissed in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise had been. Eliza lay in the snow, the wind knocked out of her. Chaska's heavy weight on top of her. He had saved her life. He had shielded her with his own body. He pushed himself up, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a strained rasp. "No," she whispered, sitting up, her mind still reeling. "No, I am all right, but you." He tried to stand, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped his lips, and he sank to one knee, his hand clutching his side. Mabel was there at once, her face etched with worry. She helped him to the fire, easing him down onto a bed of pine boughs they had gathered. When she gently pulled back his torn buckskin shirt, they saw the dark, angry bruise already forming over his ribs. "It is broken," Mabel said, her voice grim, after a gentle but firm examination. "2 ribs, I think, a clean break, but a break nonetheless." Chaska's face was slick with sweat despite the cold. Every breath was a fresh agony. He was the warrior, the protector, and now he was helpless, incapacitated by a random act of the storm. Eliza's panic was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She had been the one in need of rescue. Now it was her turn. She looked around their meager camp, her mind cataloging their few possessions. Her eyes fell on the battered, broken umbrella she had insisted on bringing from town, a foolish piece of civilization that was now hopelessly mangled. Its silk was torn, but its frame was made of thin, strong strips of bamboo. "Hold him steady," she said to Mabel, her voice taking on a new authority. She took Chaska's knife and skillfully cut away the longest, straightest sections of the bamboo frame. She tore long strips from her own petticoat, the fine cotton a stark white against the gray gloom. She worked with a focused intensity, her hands sure and steady. She knelt beside Chaska in the firelight. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. meeting his pain-filled eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod, bracing himself. With Mabel's help, Eliza gently, firmly, wrapped the linen strips around his chest, binding the broken ribs, using the bamboo strips as crude splints to hold them immobile. The process was agonizing for Chaska, but he bore it with a stoic silence, his only sound the sharp hiss of his breath through his teeth. Eliza tied the final knot, pulling it tight. "The telegraph woman," she said, her voice a little shaky, a touch of her old, dry wit returning, "also knows how to tie a good knot." He looked at her, his eyes dark with pain but holding something else, a deep and profound gratitude that needed no words. He had saved her from the falling tree. She, in turn, was now working to save him from its consequences. They were bound in a circle of sacrifice and care. That night, as the storm howled relentlessly outside their small sanctuary, a strange and solemn peace settled around the fire. The shared danger, the close brush with death, had stripped away everything but the essential. They were no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single, small tribe, a family chosen by circumstance. Mabel. 2 moons watched Eliza and Chaska as they sat near the fire. Eliza was helping him drink a hot broth she had made from their meager supplies. He leaned against the rock wall, his face etched with pain, but his eyes never left hers. Mabel saw the unspoken truth that lay between them, a bond forged in adversity, stronger than any spoken vow. The old woman reached into a leather pouch and took out a long, thin thong of tanned deerskin. It was soft and supple with age. She held it up in the firelight. "In the old times," she said, her voice a low chant against the wind, "when 2 people's spirits were tied, we did not have words for it like you do. We had actions. We had promises that the land could understand." She took Eliza's wrist, and then Chaska's. She gently, skillfully, wrapped the deerskin thong around both their wrists, lashing them together, not tightly, but with a connection that was unmistakable. They were bound, one to the other. "This is not a marriage in the way your people know it," Mabel said, her wise eyes looking from one to the other. "It is not a claim of ownership. It is a promise to stand beside each other through this season, to lend your strength to their weakness, to share your fire against their cold. That is all. It is enough." Eliza looked at the simple leather cord that now connected her to Chaska. It felt more real, more binding than any ring or contract. It was a symbol of the truth that had been growing between them. In the heart of a blizzard, surrounded by the bones of the dead, they had made a promise of life. Chaska's fingers gently brushed hers where the cord bound them. He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was overshadowed by the fierce, protective light of his vow on the mountain. He was captured for life. Eliza met his gaze, and for the first time she did not feel like a prisoner or a victim. She felt free to choose her own bonds, to tie herself not to a place or a past, but to a person, and to a cause that was just. She looked at her own breath, a white plume in the freezing air. Mingling with his, it was a silent vow, a wordless prayer sent out into the heart of the storm. The world after the blizzard was a place of blinding white and absolute silence. The snow fell for 2 days, a soft, relentless curtain that buried the valley of white bones and muffled the sound of the wind. They survived in the shallow cave, huddled around their small, precious fire, a tiny island of warmth and life in a sea of frozen death. The bond between them, forged in the storm and sealed by Mabel's deerskin thong, became their true shelter. Eliza tended to Chaska's ribs, her touch gentle but firm, while he, in turn, watched over her with a fierce, quiet intensity that was a promise in itself. When the storm finally broke, the sun that emerged was brilliant, turning the transformed landscape into a dazzling, treacherous beauty. The snow was knee-deep, and their progress down from the high country was painstakingly slow. With every step, the horses sank into the heavy, wet drifts. The pristine white began to give way to the dark, muddy earth beneath as they descended into the lower altitudes. The clean, sterile world of the blizzard was replaced by a landscape of thaw and muck, the ground a treacherous mire of half-frozen mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. They were 2 days from Red Dust Gulch, moving through a narrow, wooded canyon carved by a swollen, muddy creek, when the world fell apart. They did not hear them approach. The soft, sucking mud muffled all sound. The attack was a sudden, violent eruption from the trees. One moment, they were a tight, weary column moving through the dripping woods. The next, they were surrounded. Pike's men, a dozen of them, seemed to rise from the earth itself, their rifles leveled. And at their head, his face a mask of profound and terrible sorrow, was Etienne Lecuyer. "I am sorry." Etienne's voice was a choked, broken thing, lost in the sudden chaos. "He has my sister." Chaska reacted instantly, not with a warrior's cry, but with a desperate, protective instinct. Despite the fire that shot through his side, he spurred his horse forward, trying to place himself between Eliza and the rifles. But his injury had slowed him. He was a fraction of a second too late. 2 of Pike's men lunged, grabbing his bridle, their weight dragging his struggling horse to a halt. Tomas drew his pistol, a wild, defiant shout on his lips. But a rifle barrel slammed into the side of his head, sending him tumbling from his saddle into the thick, brown mud. Li Wei, unarmed and seeing the futility of a fight, made a choice. He was not a fighter. He was a keeper of things. He spurred his own pony, not at the attackers, but straight at Eliza, grabbing the reins of her mare. "The books, Miss Mayfield," he yelled, his voice sharp with urgency. "We must save the books." He wheeled their horses around and plunged back the way they had come, dragging a stunned Eliza with him. 2 of Pike's men fired after them, the bullets thudding into the mud nearby. But their orders were clear. The prize was Chaska. Eliza looked back, a scream tearing at her throat. She saw Chaska thrown from his horse. She saw him struggle to his feet, his hands clenched, his face a mask of cold fury. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and injured. A rifle butt caught him hard in his already broken ribs, and he collapsed, his body curling in agony on the muddy ground. They swarmed him, kicking and striking with a vicious, cowardly brutality. The last thing she saw before Li Wei dragged her around a bend in the canyon was Pike himself, astride his big bay horse, watching the scene with a smug, satisfied smile. Their escape was a desperate, panicked flight. Li Wei knew the terrain, leading them on a frantic, circuitous route through the foothills, doubling back on their trail, using every trick of the land to throw off any pursuit. They rode until the horses were lathered and trembling, until the sun began to set, painting the muddy landscape in shades of blood and rust. They entered Red Dust Gulch long after dark, 2 mud-caked ghosts slipping through the back alleys. They did not go to the mercantile or the telegraph office. Li Wei led her directly to the one place he knew they might find sanctuary, the back door of Nell Parker's boarding house. Nell opened the door to their soft, urgent knock, a lamp held high. She took in their appearance in a single, sweeping glance, the mud, the terror in Eliza's eyes, the absence of the others. She asked no questions. She simply stood aside, her face a grim, stony mask. "The cellar," she said, her voice a low command. "No one goes down there but me." The wine cellar was a small, dark space that smelled of damp earth, aging potatoes, and sour wine. It was a tomb, a place to be buried. Nell brought them blankets, a bowl of cold stew, and a jug of water. She also brought news, delivered in a flat, angry whisper. "Pike brought him in an hour ago," she said, her eyes hard as agates, paraded him down the main street like a trophy. "He is in the holding cell at the marshal's office. The whole town is buzzing. They are calling Chaska a murderer and a terrorist. Pike is telling everyone that the reward is his, and that he will see justice done himself, right here, before the federal agent from Cheyenne ever arrives." The implication was clear. Pike was not going to wait for a trial. He was going to stage a public execution, a spectacle of frontier justice to solidify his power and eliminate the one man who could expose him. After Nell left, bolting the cellar door from the outside, Eliza sank onto a pile of old burlap sacks, the cold of the dirt floors seeping into her. The stolen ledgers, still safe in their canvas sack, felt like a block of ice beside her. She was a fugitive, hiding in a hole in the ground, while the man who had saved her life, the man to whom she was bound by a promise of deerskin and shared breath, was in a cage, waiting to die. The whispers of the town filtered down through the floorboards, distorted and venomous. She heard the laughter from the saloon, the self-righteous pronouncements of men who had never faced a choice harder than what to drink. They were feasting on the downfall of a man they called a savage, while celebrating the man who was strangling the life from their land. She sat in the darkness, the world narrowed to the small, suffocating space of the cellar. She was caught in an impossible vice. She had the evidence, the ledgers, the telegram, the invoice. She could trade them. She could go to Pike, offer him the books in exchange for Chaska's life. He would probably agree. He would take the evidence, destroy it, and let Chaska disappear back into the hills. A free man who had lost his war. Her personal debt would be paid. He would be safe. Or she could fight. She could use the weapon she still possessed. She could try to get the story out, to scream the truth so loudly that even the willfully deaf would have to hear. But that would take time. The agent from Cheyenne was still days away. To reveal the evidence now would be to sign Chaska's death warrant. Pike, seeing his lies exposed, would surely kill Chaska immediately to silence him forever. Love versus the greater good. The life of one man against the future of a people, of the land itself. She touched the deerskin thong still tied around her wrist. It was a promise to stand beside him through this season. What did that promise demand of her now? To save his body by sacrificing his cause, or to honor his spirit by fighting the war he had started, even if it cost him his life? She remembered his face in the lightning flash, his voice in the miner's shack, the one captured for life. He had not been speaking of a cage. He had been speaking of a commitment, a bond to something truer than his own survival. To trade the books for his life would be to dishonor that man, to undo the very reason he had fought in the first place. A new, cold resolve settled over her, chilling her more than the blizzard ever had. She was done hiding. She was done being a victim. Chaska had started this by seizing her voice. She would finish it by using it. When Nell came down in the pre-dawn hours with a cup of hot coffee, she found Eliza on her feet, her face pale in the lamplight but her eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "I need paper and a pen," Eliza said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "And I need to get into my office. Tonight." Nell looked at the young woman before her and saw that the girl who had arrived in Red Dust Gulch was gone forever. In her place stood a leader. "What are you going to do, child?" "I am going to make the wire sing," Eliza said. She made her choice. She would not negotiate with a tyrant. She would expose him. She spent the day in the cellar, with Li Wei and Tomas, who had been hiding in the mercantile, meticulously copying the most damning pages of the ledgers, the forged seal, and the telegram. She was splitting her forces. One set of copies for the court, another for the press. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Nell Parker led her through the darkened back alleys of Red Dust Gulch. The town was quiet, but it was a tense, watchful silence. They reached the telegraph office. The lock was a small, insignificant obstacle. Inside, the office was cold and silent. The brass key gleamed in the moonlight slanting through the window. It looked like a sacred object on an altar. This was her church, and this was her prayer. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of metal and dust and ozone. She told Thomas and Li Wei her plan, her voice a low, urgent whisper. They would not wait for Pike's sham trial. They had to get Chaska out. While the town slept, they would plan a rescue. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but it was better than the slow, suffocating death of doing nothing. Then, she sat down at her desk. She placed the copies of the evidence beside the telegraph key. She thought of Chaska, alone in his cell, of the deerskin thong that still bound her to him. Her fingers found their place on the key. She was no longer sending messages about freight manifests or the price of beef. She was sending the truth. The first sharp, clear clicks cut through the silence of the room. The sound traveled out from the small office, transformed into an invisible current, humming along the iron wire that stretched across the vast, dark prairie. The wire, strung taut in the night wind, vibrated with the weight of her message. It was a lonely, defiant sound, a single string on a great, dark instrument, a harp of truth playing a song of rebellion into the heart of the sleeping land. The moon was a sliver of polished bone, casting a cold, impartial light on the scene at the Coyote Creek trestle. The bridge stood as a stark skeleton against the star-dusted sky, its timbers groaning softly in the night wind. Upon this precarious stage, Jedediah Pike had assembled his theater of cruelty. A dozen of his hired guns, their faces hard and shadowed in the flickering torchlight, formed a loose semicircle. In the center, his hands bound tightly behind him, stood Chaska. He was bruised and beaten, his breathing still shallow from his broken ribs. But he stood straight, his gaze fixed not on his tormentors, but on the dark, distant hills. A thick rope was slung over a high crossbeam, its end fashioned into a hangman's noose that rested loosely on the ground. Pike sat on his horse, a thick cigar glowing in the darkness, the very picture of a man savoring his victory. He was not just killing an enemy, he was making a statement, a public lesson in power written in the language of terror. When the sun comes up, Pike's voice boomed, echoing in the vast, empty space of the gorge. The whole territory is going to see what happens to thieves and insurgents. They are going to see what happens when you stand in the way of progress. This man's body will be a monument to the new law in this land. My law. He was playing to his audience of thugs, but his words were meant for the silent, watching town, for the very hills themselves. What he did not know was that the hills were watching back, and the town was no longer silent. High on a ridge to the north, Mabel. 2 moons held a pine-pitched torch. She stood as still as the ancient rocks around her, her eyes fixed on the distant drama at the bridge, in a small, dark chapel at the edge of Red Dust Gulch. Nell Parker stood by the bell rope, her hand resting on the rough hemp, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a sentinel's. They were the 2 ends of a signal, the first notes in a symphony of rebellion. Closer to the bridge, hidden in a deep washout carved by 100 years of flash floods, Li Wei and Tomas knelt over a small wooden crate. Inside, cushioned in sawdust, were 3 sticks of the blasting powder Li Wei sold at his mercantile. It was not a bomb meant to kill. It was a tool of misdirection, a voice intended to speak the language of chaos that Pike's men would understand. Tomas, his hand surprisingly steady, carefully placed a blasting cap in a long, slow-burning fuse. And a half-mile down the track, where the iron rails ran straight into the darkness, Eliza stood beside a telegraph pole. In her hand, she held a pair of heavy wire cutters from Nell's tool shed. The cold steel felt alien and yet perfectly familiar. She had spent years using a key to send messages of order and connection along this very wire. Now, she was going to use a different tool to create a profound and strategic silence. This single strand of iron was Pike's connection to his reinforcements, to the corrupt officials who would endorse his lies. Tonight, that connection would be severed. On the ridge, Mabel saw Pike dismount and pick up the noose. The time had come. She lifted her torch and swept it 3 times in a wide, fiery arc against the blackness of the sky. The signal was seen. "Now," Eliza whispered to the wind. She placed the jaws of the cutters around the taut wire and squeezed with all her strength. The wire gave way with a sharp, metallic twang, a single, discordant note that died instantly in the vast quiet of the plains. The line to Cheyenne was dead. In the washout, Tomas saw the flash of Mabel's torch. He struck a match, the small flame cupped in his hands, and touched it to the end of the fuse. It sputtered, then caught, a tiny, determined snake of fire eating its way toward the powder. "Go!" he whispered to Li Wei. They scrambled out of the gully and ran for the cover of the trees. The explosion was not a deafening boom, but a deep, concussive whump that seemed to come from the very gut of the earth. It erupted from a rock slide 100 yards from the bridge, sending a shower of dirt, gravel, and shattered rock into the air. It was a perfectly placed piece of theater. To Pike's men, their nerves already on edge, it sounded like the opening volley of a massive, coordinated attack from the hills. Panic was instantaneous. These were not soldiers fighting for a cause. They were men paid in coin, and their lives were worth more than Pike's ambition. A second, smaller charge, planted by Li Wei on the opposite side of the tracks, went off, adding to the illusion of a full-scale ambush. The hired guns broke and ran. They fired their rifles wildly into the darkness, their panicked shots echoing in the canyon. And then they fled, scrambling for their horses, melting back into the night that had spawned them. In the ensuing chaos, Pike roared with fury, his orders lost in the cacophony. A dark shape detached itself from the shadows near the bridge's abutment. It was Tomas. He ran low and fast, a knife flashing in his hand as he sliced through the ropes binding Chaska's wrists. Pike turned, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, to see his prisoner free and his private army deserting him. He was left with only 2 of his most loyal men. He drew his pistol, his eyes wild. "You will not escape me," he snarled, leveling the gun at Chaska. But Chaska was no longer the target. He was the hunter. He moved with a speed that belied his injuries, closing the distance between them. He did not go for the gun. He kicked out, his boot connecting with Pike's wrist. The pistol clattered onto the wooden beams of the bridge. One of Pike's remaining men charged, but a well-aimed rock, thrown from the darkness by Li Wei, caught him in the temple, and he crumpled to the ground. The final gunman fired a wild shot, the bullet splintering the wood near Chaska's head, then turned and fled into the night. Now they were alone. Chaska and Pike, 2 men on a narrow, wind-swept bridge, suspended over a black and hungry abyss. Pike, his face contorted with hate, lunged at Chaska. He was a bigger man, fueled by pure, brutish rage. But Chaska was quicker, his movements honed by a lifetime of discipline. The fight was not a graceful duel. It was a desperate, ugly struggle on a slippery, narrow beam. They swayed on the edge of the chasm, their grunts and the scrape of their boots the only sounds in the sudden quiet. Chaska saw an opening. He ducked under a wild swing from Pike and drove his shoulder hard into the bigger man's midsection. Pike staggered back, his boot heel slipping off the edge of the beam. For a terrifying second, he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling, his eyes wide with the primal fear of falling. Chaska lunged forward and grabbed the front of Pike's shirt, hauling him back from the edge. He did not save him out of mercy. He saved him for a different kind of justice. He spun Pike around and slammed him face down onto the beams. He had him. He could end it right there. His hands closed around Pike's throat, and for a heartbeat, the image of his brother, Tasunke, filled his mind. The cycle of vengeance demanded blood. The rage in his heart screamed for it. But then he saw Eliza's face, her clear, steady eyes in the miner's shack. He felt the phantom pressure of the deerskin thong on his wrist, a promise not of death, but of a shared future. He looked down at the pathetic, gasping man beneath him, and he saw not a monster, but just a man, shrunken by his own greed and hate. To kill him would be to become him. His grip loosened. With a deep, shuddering breath, he let go of Pike's throat. He reached for the rope that had been meant for his own neck. He did not refashion the noose. He simply used the thick hemp to bind Pike's hands tightly behind his back. He had won the fight, and in sparing his enemy's life, He had won a much larger war, the one inside his own soul. As he stood up, he saw them. A small group of figures approaching from the townside of the bridge, their lanterns swinging in the darkness. At their head was Marshal Whitcomb. The old lawman's shoulders were no longer stooped. His face was set with a grim, new-found determination. Eliza's message had done its work. The truth had given a weak man the strength to be brave. Jedediah Pike. The marshal's voice was clear and strong, ringing out in the night air. By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, based on evidence provided by Miss Eliza Mayfield, I am placing you under arrest for fraud, theft of federal resources, and conspiracy to incite violence. As the marshal spoke, a single, final gunshot echoed from the direction of the fleeing gunman. It was a last, spiteful act of a coward. A cry of pain came from the shadows near the bridge's entrance. Etienne Lequier crumpled to the ground. He had appeared from the woods, drawn by the sounds of the fight, trying to find his younger sister, whom Pike had brought to the bridge as a final piece of leverage. He had been moving her to safety when the stray bullet found him. Mabel Two Moons, who had made her way down from the ridge, was the first to reach him. She knelt in the dirt and lifted his head into her lap, her hand gently brushing the hair from his sweat-soaked forehead. Eliza and Chaska rushed to his side. The wound was in his chest, a dark, spreading stain on his buckskin shirt. There was nothing anyone could do. Etienne's eyes, clouded with pain, found Mabel's. "I am sorry," he whispered, the words a painful gasp. "Forgive." Mabel looked down at the tormented man, her ancient face filled not with anger, but with a deep, profound sorrow. "The spirits see the heart, little brother," she said softly, her voice a low, gentle chant. "They do not see the mistakes. Be at peace." A final, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he was still. He died in the arms of the matriarch of the people he had betrayed. His tragic circle closed at last, as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. A new sound drifted up from the valley. It was the clear, steady ring of the small chapel bell. 1, 2, 3 strokes, then a pause. Then again, Nell Parker was ringing in the new day. It was a sound of hope, of order restored, of a community awakening from a long and terrible nightmare. On the bridge, Chaska and Eliza stood together, the deerskin thongs still connecting their wrists. They looked not at the bound and defeated Pike, but at each other, their faces illuminated by the coming dawn. Justice had come, not swift and clean like a bullet, but slow, hard-won, and stained with the mud and tragedy of the land itself. The bell continued to ring, its simple, honest voice, promising that after the long night, there was always the morning. The aftermath of the battle on the trestle bridge was not loud, but quiet. The noise of gunfire and explosions gave way to the steady, methodical sound of a community beginning to mend itself. Jedediah Pike did not leave Red Dust Gulch in chains to the sound of a jeering crowd. He left in the gray light of dawn, seated in the back of a buckboard wagon, Marshal Whitcomb holding the reins, a newly polished star gleaming on his chest. The town watched him go in a silence that was far more damning than any shout. It was the silence of judgment, the quiet turning of a page. The next day, Marshal Whitcomb, his back straighter than anyone had seen it in years, sat at his desk, with Eliza standing as a witness. He took a pen and, with a firm, steady hand, signed 2 official documents. The first was an order to dismantle the illegal diversion canal Pike had built, declaring it a public nuisance and a theft of territorial water resources. The second was a nullification of the fraudulent land claims based on the forged seal, restoring the traditional boundaries of the Lakota hunting grounds as recognized by prior, legitimate treaties. The papers were simple, the ink black on white, but they were the culmination of everything they had fought for. They were the law, finally bent back toward justice. Within a week, a crew of men, including a newly deputized and immensely proud Tomas, rowed out with shovels and pry bars. They did not just break the canal, they unmade it, filling the trench, tearing down the wooden sluices, and freeing the sacred spring to once again feed the Powder River. Eliza and Chaska stood on the same bluff where he had first seen Pike's men fire on his people. They watched as the first new pulse of clear, cold water pushed through the mud, a lifeblood returning to a dying artery. The river began to run again, not with the full force of spring, but with a steady, determined flow. It was a promise kept. The cost of that promise was buried 3 days later, on a low, wind-swept hill overlooking the town. The cemetery in Red Dust Gulch was a lonely place, a small collection of tilting wooden markers and a few modest stone monuments to lives cut short by hardship and the unforgiving land. They gathered there to lay Etienne Lecuyer to rest, a small, somber assembly of the people his final choices had touched. His young sister, her face pale with grief, stood between Nell Parker and Eliza, drawing strength from their quiet solidarity. There was no priest. The town's chapel was a place of intermittent faith, its preacher having long since departed for greener pastures, so they made their own service, a patchwork of grief and grace. Eliza, her voice clear in the high, thin air, read a short passage she had chosen not from the fire and brimstone of the Old Testament, but from the quiet hope of the New. She read of peacemakers and of laying down heavy burdens, her words a balm on the raw wound of their loss. When she finished, Chaska stepped forward. He knelt by the simple wooden cross that marked the head of the grave. He said nothing. He reached into the small pouch at his belt and took out the single, iridescent magpie feather he had carried in his braid. It was the feather he had worn in memory of his brother, a symbol of a warrior's spirit, of a debt of blood. He held it for a moment, the wind ruffling its edges, and then he gently tucked it into the soft, freshly turned earth of the grave. It was a gesture of profound forgiveness, a laying to rest not just of a man, but of the cycle of vengeance that had consumed him. He was releasing Etienne from his debt, and in doing so, freeing himself from the last vestiges of his own hate. Then Mabel Two Moons began to sing. It was not a song of sorrow, but a chant, a low, keening melody that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It spoke of a spirit's journey across the plains of the sky, of a return to the great circle of life. Her voice, ancient and powerful, mingled with the sigh of the wind, a Lakota prayer for a French-Canadian soul under an American sky. 3 cultures, 3 rituals of farewell, all offered at a single grave. In their shared grief, they had found a new and sacred kind of harmony. In the weeks that followed, the harvest began. The seeds of courage they had planted in the dark soil of fear and corruption started to bear fruit. The town of Red Dust Gulch, shocked out of its fearful complacency, began to change. The swaggering arrogance of Pike's men was gone, replaced by a quieter, more watchful atmosphere. Eliza reopened the small schoolhouse that had been shuttered for months. She taught the town's children their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them things not found in books. She spoke of the different people who called this land home, of the promises that were written on paper, and the ones that were written on the heart. Her classroom was small, a handful of children from the town and, after a hesitant start, 2 Lakota children who Mabel brought down from the valley, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Li Wei, no longer content to be a silent observer, expanded his mercantile. He built a small, clean food counter at the front of his shop, serving hot bowls of noodles and savory meat dumplings. His cooking, once a private comfort, became a public offering, a place where people gathered, drawn by the good food and the quiet, steady presence of the man who had risked everything for his neighbors. Tomas, his family's grazing lands now greening with the return of the water, became a figure of respect. He led the other ranchers in organizing a new cattlemen's association, one based not on exclusion and intimidation, but on fair access to the shared resources of the land. He was no longer just a vaquero. He was a leader, his easy humor now tempered with a hard-won wisdom. The most profound change, however, was happening in the hills. The railroad surveyor's wooden stakes, the symbols of Pike's false claim, were pulled from the ground one by one. In their place, Chaska and his people built new markers. They did not use wood. They used the stones of the land itself, gathering the flat, weathered granite from the ridges and building low, solid cairns. Each one was a small, deliberate act of reclamation. Each stone, placed by hand, was a testament to their endurance, a physical manifestation of the promise Mabel had spoken of in the heart of the blizzard. These markers would not rot or be easily moved. They would stand for generations, as steadfast and permanent as the mountains themselves. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the vast sky in shades of rose and gold, Eliza and Chaska stood on the ridge where he had first left her to return to the town. From here, they could see everything. The small, orderly shape of Red Dust Gulch, a plume of smoke rising from Lee Wei's kitchen, the dark green line of the rejuvenated Powder River, and beyond, the open, rolling plains where the new stone cairns stood like silent, patient sentinels. "We could leave," Eliza said, her voice soft. "The railroad agent in Cheyenne offered me a position at the main depot. A good one, and your people are safe now." "You could lead them further west, away from the railroad, away from all of this." Chaska looked out at the land, his land. He was a free man. The bounty on his head was gone, his name cleared. He could go anywhere, but his gaze kept returning to the small town, to the river, to the woman standing beside him. "To leave would be to say that this place cannot be a home for us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It would be to let Pike win. In the end, he wanted to divide this land into his and ours. If we leave, it will always be divided." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "My world is there," he said, nodding toward the plains and the hidden valley. "Your world is there." He motioned toward the town and the distant glint of the telegraph wire. "We are standing on the shore between them. To leave is to choose one shore over the other, but to stay is to try and build a bridge." Eliza looked at his hand, then at her own. The deerskin thong was gone, worn away by their struggles, but the memory of its connection remained, a phantom bond on her wrist. She knew he was right. Their story was not an escape. It was a beginning. "A bridge is a hard thing to build," she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Harder to live without one," he replied. He pointed to a long, low wall of stacked stones that ran along the crest of the ridge, built by some long-forgotten hand to shelter travelers from the relentless wind. "Our people build those," he said. "A windbreak. It does not stop the wind. The wind is too strong, but it creates a place of shelter behind it, a place where things can live and grow. That is what we can be. Eliza, not a wall to keep the worlds apart, but a shelter where they can learn to grow together." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough buckskin of his shirt familiar and comforting. They stood together on the ridge, two people from two different worlds, choosing to build their future not on one shore or the other, but on the hard, necessary, and hopeful ground in between. The sun set, the first stars appeared, and the wind blew, but behind the shelter of their promise, a new kind of harvest had just begun. The first winter came softly, not with the sudden, violent fury of the blizzard in the mountains, but with a gentle, insistent quiet. Snow fell for a week, a thick, white blanket that muffled the world, burying the ruts in the street and draping the raw-boned shoulders of Red Dust Gulch in a mantle of pristine peace. It was a time for drawing inward, for the warmth of a stove and the slow work of hands. Their home was the telegraph office, expanded and transformed. A small but sturdy living space had been added to the back, built with the help of Tomas and Lee Wei, its new pine walls smelling of resin and the promise of a future. The front room, however, remained Eliza's domain. The brass key and sounder sitting on the desk like the silent, watchful heart of the house. The wire still connected them to the outside world, but its voice was different now. It spoke of cattle prices and train schedules, of the mundane and necessary rhythms of a town putting itself back together. It no longer screamed with lies. Eliza sat in a rocking chair near the cast-iron stove, its belly glowing with a cherry-red warmth. The wind moaned outside, a familiar, lonely sound. But here, in this small circle of light and heat, it was only a reminder of the shelter they had built. In her hands was a work in progress, a large, intricate quilt. Her needle, guided by a simple silver thimble, moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. The thimble was new. Chaska had bought it for her at a trading post 50 miles down the line, a place they had journeyed to for supplies a month earlier. He had presented it to her without a word, simply placing the small, gleaming object in her palm. It was not a ring, not a piece of jewelry meant for show. It was a tool, an acknowledgement of her skill, a gift of quiet, practical love. When she was not using it, she kept it on the desk, right beside the telegraph key. The two objects, one for mending cloth and the other for mending a community, seemed to belong together. Chaska sat across from her, mending a piece of tack, his hands, so capable of both gentleness and violence, moving with a focused grace. The deep bruise on his ribs had faded to a pale yellow shadow, and he breathed easily now. But the experience had left a new quietness in his eyes, a depth of contemplation that had not been there before. They often sat like this for hours, in a comfortable silence that needed no words to fill it. They had spoken a lifetime's worth of words in the heart of storms and in the face of death. Now was a time for the silent language of shared presence. Eliza held up the quilt, examining her work in the lamplight. It was a map of their journey, a testament written in thread and calico. Each square told a part of the story. In the center was a square of dark, iridescent silk, intricately stitched to resemble a single magpie feather. It was a memorial to a brother lost and a betrayer forgiven. Next to it was a square of stark white linen, upon which she had embroidered a circle of brilliant red thread, the color of the forged wax seal, the color of the drop of horse blood that had stained the stolen ledger. It was a reminder of the cost of truth. She ran her new thimble over another square, a simple patch of gray wool the color of a river stone, the one Chaska had given her to steady her hands, the first unspoken acknowledgement of the bond between them. Her needle was currently finishing the edge of a square depicting a small, silver handbell, its thread shimmering like a hopeful sound in the quiet room. "The cold will be deep this year," Chaska said, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the quiet. "The beavers have built their lodges high on the creek bank. They know what is coming." "We have enough wood," Eliza said, her eyes still on her work. "And Nell brought a sack of potatoes and smoked hams yesterday. She said it was an early Christmas gift, but I think she just worries we will starve." A small smile touched Chaska's lips. "She worries for everyone. It is her way of being strong." Their chosen family had seen them through the autumn. Nell, with her fierce, maternal practicality. Li Wei, with his quiet, unwavering loyalty. Thomas, with his boisterous humor and steadfast friendship. They were the cornerstones of this new life, the proof that a family was not always the one you were born into, but sometimes the one you built in the aftermath of a storm. Later that week, as the snow fell thick and fast outside, they gathered in the small, warm room. Nell and Mabel Two Moons, Thomas and Li Wei. It was not a party. It was a ceremony, as quiet and solemn as the winter landscape. There was no preacher, no book of common prayer. There was only the fire, and the presence of those who had weathered the storm with them. Mabel stepped forward into the center of the room, her face a beautiful map of wisdom in the flickering firelight. In her hands, she held two simple cords. One was a thong of soft, smoked deerskin, the color of the earth. The other was a length of thick wool yarn, spun by Eliza herself, the color of the deep blue sky over the plains in late summer. "There are two paths to the same mountain peak," Mabel said, her voice as soft as the falling snow. "One is the path of the earth, of the rock and the root and the river. The other is the path of the sky, of the wire that sings and the words that are written. Neither path is better. They are just different ways of knowing. A person needs both the earth under their feet and the sky over their head to be whole." She took Eliza's left hand and gently tied the blue wool yarn loosely around her wrist. Then she took Chaska's left hand and tied the deerskin thong. She did not tie them together. She tied the cords in parallel, a symbol of two lives, two worlds, running alongside each other, bound not by force, but by choice. "The promise is a simple one," Mabel continued, her eyes moving from Eliza to Chaska. "It is to keep what is given, and to give back what we can, to hold fast to the truth you have found, to the life you have saved, to the love that has taken root in hard ground, and to give back to each other, and to this land, the strength of your hands, the wisdom of your heart, and the shelter of your spirit." Eliza looked at Chaska, his face serious and calm in the warm light. "I will keep what you have given me," she said, her voice a soft, clear promise. He met her gaze, his dark eyes holding an ocean of devotion. "I will give you all that I am," he replied. And that was all. There were no other words. Nell Parker wiped a tear from her eye with the back of her hand, and Thomas let out a whoop of joy that made everyone laugh, breaking the solemnity and filling the room with a sudden, brilliant warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The final scene of their story unfolded not in the drama of a high-noon confrontation, but in the quiet majesty of a winter dawn. They stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge where they had parted and where they had chosen to stay. The world was a canvas of impossible beauty, the fresh snow painted in strokes of deep rose and soft gold by the rising sun. The air was so cold it was a pain to breathe, but it was clean and pure. The Powder River, now flowing freely, was a dark, steaming ribbon in the white landscape, its edges laced with intricate patterns of ice. In the distance, on the far side of the river, a dark, moving shape resolved itself in the clear light. It was a small herd of bison, their shaggy coats dusted with snow, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were a sight that had become rare in these parts, a symbol of an older, wilder world, returning to a land that was beginning to heal. Eliza pulled the thick bison robe tighter around her shoulders, the same robe she had worn in the blizzard, a permanent fixture now in their home. She thought of her journey, from the girl who had fled a broken past, seeking a freedom she thought meant being untied from everything, to the woman she was now, bound by love, by loyalty, by a fierce and protective sense of place. "It turns out freedom," she said, her voice a soft plume of white in the cold air, "is choosing to be tied to what is right." Chaska slipped his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked down at her, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face, a smile she had once been told he was saving for when there was water. The river was flowing, and his smiles were frequent now. He had a lifetime of them saved up for her. "I am captured for life." "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble, half joke and half the most sacred vow he had ever made. She leaned her head against his chest, her world reduced to the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. The sun cleared the horizon, flooding the valley with a brilliant, hopeful light. In their small cabin, the quilt lay finished on the bed, a map of their survival. The magpie feather for forgiveness, the red seal for the truth, the river stone for the first promise, the deerskin thong for their shared vow, and the silver bell for the awakening of hope. It was a story of a harsh and beautiful land, and of the two people who had chosen to build a bridge across its heart, a shelter against the wind where a new kind of life could finally take root, deep and strong, under the winter frost. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.